this is perfect.
Reykjavik, Iceland, and Oslo, Norway, are two of the world's northernmost capital cities, with shared Nordic histories, Viking lore, and a questionable willingness to swim in ice-cold water. But as the capital cities of Iceland and Norway respectively, each city has a distinctive culture, identity, and cityscape of its own. A lot of blogs and documentaries like to stack up the cities by their numbers, but today we're going to go a little deeper than the surface level. Here on A Sense of Travel, my goal is to capture all 5 senses of as many cities, countries, and natural wonders around the world as possible, so that I can accurately immerse you into the physical experience of these places through the screen. That said, we're not looking at rankings or objective reasons as to why one city is better than the other. Instead, how do the Reykjavik and Oslo experiences stack up in their contrasting visual environs, the way the air smells, the delicious culinary classics that define their taste palates, the sounds that fill your ears in the city streets, the way the air physically feels, and the ambience and lore that creates the magic of the atmosphere? We'll find out today in the latest installment of Comparing the Senses, Reykjavik versus Oslo. Before we take on the senses, I want to emphasize again that the idea here isn't to rank these two cities or to compare things like HDI, GDP, and quality of life. This is entirely focused on the 5 senses that create the atmosphere of each city. However, we'll still take a quick look at the cities by the numbers. Reykjavik sits on the west coast of the island of Iceland, surrounded by distant, glacier-capped mountains and some recently active volcanic landscapes. Iceland's capital and by far its largest city, Reykjavik is home to nearly 140,000 people within its bounds, and close to 250,000 people in its metro area. To the southeast, on the Scandinavian peninsula, Oslo is the capital of Norway and quite a bit larger than Reykjavik, home to a little over 700,000 people in the city limits and around 1.6 million in the metro area. Both cities and their respective countries make up a part of the Nordic region, which includes the countries of Iceland, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. So the first thing to look at when stacking up Reykjavik and Oslo is perhaps the most obvious: their dense, historic, and distinctively different cityscapes. We'll kick off in Reykjavik. With a lively main street, quiet old neighborhoods, hilly parks, and rugged surroundings, the heart of Reykjavik somehow manages to feel like a bustling urban center, a quaint Nordic fishing village, and a remote subarctic outpost all at once. Surrounded by the icy, bold blue waters of the North Atlantic Ocean, ice-capped mountains, and rolling hills covered in volcanic rock and subarctic brush, Reykjavik has a distinctive sense of place. In other words, just from looking around you, there's no question of where in the world you are. Almost everywhere you look, tin metal roofs point up above metal, plaster, and occasionally pebbly stucco facades, sometimes bursting in bold colors, but primarily in soft grays, blending seamlessly into the cool landscape. While the buildings here are pretty simple, all things considered, there's still a little bit of Norse influence. Unlike a lot of European city centers, there's not exactly an old town here in Reykjavik, but there is a pulsing heartbeat. Reykjavik Street. One of the oldest streets in Reykjavik and the pulse of Icelandic nightlife, shopping, and apparently bachelorette parties, Reykjavik Street is where that bustling urban center feeling comes into play. Narrow, tree-lined, and mostly blocked off from cars, there's a truly warm and cozy vibe here. It's as if all of Reykjavik decided to meet up at their favorite brewery for a casual kickback. Tons of colorful street art, cool bars, for example, one that looks like an old bookstore, record stores, and microbreweries line the streets behind 3 to 4 story tin metal and plaster building facades of beige, silver, deep red, and black. Reykjavik city center itself is cozy in context, but at the same time, you can't shake that otherworldly feeling.
It isn't just the molten lava off the freeways or the snow-capped mountains or the big, majestic cliff sides. I mean, Reykjavik just generally feels an entire planet away.
From above, that feeling that Reykjavik is the most remote city in the world really starts to solidify. The brown, gray, and green rugged mountains that dominate the horizon, frosted on their peaks with snow, hover above the deep, cold harbor in a blue haze. A few spires and high-rises pop up, especially near the water, but generally speaking, Reykjavik sits low to the ground, a response to those harsh, windy winters. The cityscape truly is a breathtaking sight to behold.
The craziest part for me is that for people who live here in Reykjavik, this view is normal.
Much like Reykjavik, Oslo's cityscape is clearly influenced by icy saltwater. In this case, that of the Oslo fjord on which it sits, at the base of a sloping hill. Oslo's cityscape is quite similar to Reykjavik's, believe it or not, in that it features simple and yet elegant architecture and an eclectic mix of 21st century glass and steel. You know, I'm not usually a big fan of modern, boxy cityscapes, but Oslo is a bit of an exception.
Oslo is a city with proof that you can combine both classical and modern architecture in your cityscape and still have a distinct form of character.
Places like the Munch Museum, angled, sharp, and a great capture of the Norwegian artist's intensity, or the sloping, marble-clad opera house, blend beautifully with the classical architecture of the royal buildings, theaters, and blocks within the city center, the medieval architecture like at the seaside Akershus fortress, the wooden ships in the harbor, and the colorful homes dotting the surrounding green hills, giving Oslo a sense of place just as strong as Reykjavik's. As you gaze beyond the low-rise city center, opposite the rolling hillsides covered in a hazy mist and what looks like mountainside villages, you see a series of lush, green, peaceful islands in the harbor like Huvudøya, where tree-covered rocky cliffsides, rippling beaches, and even old stone monastery ruins await.
If I am to find any trolls in Oslo, it'll be in here.
Oslo's old city center, known simply as Centrum, is the heartbeat of the city, designed in the rare European grid dating back to the 17th century. Oslo's blocks of classical buildings are quite colorful. The color palettes on those plaster facades range from pastels, cool grays and blues, to richer colors like gold and yellow, rustic red, and even pops of purple and lavender. Breaking up those colors, many of the blocks are filled with simple brick from the 20th century and metallic and glass finishes from more recent years. In fact, there's quite a bit of densely packed, intriguing, and quite unique modern architecture in the city's downtown. To place yourself imaginatively into the cobbled Centrum streets, imagine the dense blocks of colorful, classically designed buildings mixed in with brick and occasionally postmodern design. Sites like Oslo's 20th century City Hall, the 21st century shiny boxes along the waterfront, and the medieval Akershus fortress make for quite an interesting patchwork within the old city. As you look up, the occasional big, aged bronze dome pops out. While the Oslo cityscape at large is modern and shiny, half-timbers, wooden houses, stave churches, and thatched roof remnants of the Norway of old still stand in places like the Norwegian Folk Museum, an absolute must if you're ever in town. To sum it up quickly, Reykjavik is a seaside city whose low-rise metallic walls, jagged snow-capped mountains, volcanic rock, bustling downtown, and colorful neighborhoods make it feel like a bustling urban center, a quaint Nordic fishing village, a remote subarctic outpost, and on an entirely different planet, all at once. Whereas Oslo is a bit more grand thanks to places like the Opera House and Akershus Fortress, feels a bit more rooted in mythology thanks to the dramatic hillsides and islands and places like the Norwegian Folk Museum, and certainly larger. Both cities are stunningly beautiful. Now, the city's color palettes differ quite a bit regarding their overall cityscapes, as indicated here. When you see a video or a picture of a place and you try to imagine what it must feel like to actually be there, an important component of that is the way the air smells. Let's see how Reykjavik and Oslo stack up. Reykjavik's scentscape, particularly during my springtime visit, is as crisp, fresh, and wild as the island of Iceland itself. There's nothing dense about the cityscape, and you'll find tons of fields and gardens wafting up the scents of dandelions, lupine, birch trees, tansy shrubs, and a little bit of fir up to your nostrils. And maybe even a little bit of seagull and duck poop near the waterfronts. Now, it's here near the water, or within those steaming hot geothermal springs, that you'll really start to notice one of Reykjavik's defining notes: sulfur.
Now, the water does smell like sulfur, so like as you kind of waft it towards your nose and like run it through your hair and stuff, like you might kind of smell like sulfur too. If you ask my girlfriend, I always smell like that anyway, so.
In addition to the sense of sulfur coming off the steaming hot water and city ponds like Tjornin, you'll also, of course, catch wafts of salt water breezing up from the ocean. If I were to create a candle that smelled just like Reykjavik, it would smell of lupine, birchwood, fir, salt water, and, although not the most pleasant thing ever, sulfur. Despite the fact that it's quite a bit larger than Reykjavik, Oslo's scentscape is still fresh, crisp, and evident of a city that's quite remote.
You know, it's interesting wandering through downtown because even though we're in the heart of a major city, it still smells woodsy and fresh, and like trees. And a little bit modern, right? You know that smell that modern buildings can give off, the metal, the concrete, a little bit of that. But for the most part, it's a very fresh smelling place.
The brackish water here smells faintly salty, and given the remote and less industrial nature of the city, the natural scents of earth and greenery are thicker than in other parts of Europe. Old stave churches like in the Norwegian Folk Museum, wooden docks, boats, and wooden houses add abundant scents of damp, aged wood into the air. All things considered, an Oslo-scented candle, were I to make one, would include notes of new steel, aged wood, lupine, wild grass, and saltwater. Let me know in the comments which of these two cities has a scent profile that you prefer more. Maybe I'll create these candles one day after all. I've always found that the food in the Nordic region is vastly underrated and doesn't deserve the hate a lot of people seem to give it. There are some truly delicious, warm, and hearty staples in this rugged and chilly part of the world. And each Nordic country has a unique culinary identity to bring to the table. Now, these are just a few examples that I was able to try, but let's take a look at how they stack up. Unlike many capital cities I've been to, because Reykjavik is home to the vast majority of Icelanders, the food is actually pretty local and authentic. Now, I will say before we dive in, holy cow is Reykjavik expensive. By far the most expensive place I have ever been. But alas, here are a few, but of course not all, of the classic Icelandic dishes that really capture the Reykjavik experience. Plökkuri with rye. Let's start with the signature. Icelandic fish is a centerpiece of the cuisine here, and plökkuri is a traditional fish stew that's chock full of it. Thick, warm, and, of course, fishy, plökkuri has a bit of a peppery kick to it and comes with the most classic of Nordic pairings: rye bread. Kjötsúpa. It's pretty cold here for most of the year, so it's no surprise that soup is a staple here in Iceland. There are also a lot of lambs. Enter lamb meat soup. The warm stew is filled with vegetables, potatoes, and, of course, lamb meat. The lamb is quite strong in this soup, but otherwise, it's a perfect warm dish after a harsh winter's day. Or so I imagine. It was hot the whole time I was there. Kleinur. Let's move on to something sweeter and certainly cheaper. Kleinur, or the Icelandic twisted donut, is a great coffee pairing or afternoon snack. Fried and very crunchy, these golden brown twisted donuts taste like a typical cake donut, but with the joy of that extra crunch. For only 290 kronas, you can load up on these guys.
Hálkarl. I'm not even gonna lie, this is about to be the weirdest thing I've ever eaten.
I'm wrapping up our Icelandic tastes with something that isn't so much a recommendation, but rather a warning. Hálkarl, or fermented shark, is a national dish. Here's how it works. You eat the shark, and as the overwhelming sense of ammonia gets to you, you sip on brennivin, a caraway-flavored Icelandic schnapps. This is, an acquired taste. If you can gain a taste for ammonia, that is. I've never not been able to finish a dish while traveling, but this one was a first. Just like Iceland, Norway is an expensive country to travel to. There is no doubt about it. The food in Oslo, likewise, can be pretty pricey, although maybe not quite as much so as in Reykjavik. Brunost. Brown cheese is a Norwegian staple, and you can find it on several dishes. My breakfasts nearly every morning in Oslo included multiple slices of tasteful brown cheese between two thick bread rolls filled with nuts and raisins. Brown cheese can even be found on waffles. Jutkaker. Meatballs in Oslo, in my personal opinion, have a bit of an edge over the meatballs in Stockholm, Sweden, where they're a bit more of a cultural staple. Norwegian meatballs are huge and dense, and when coupled with a smoky meatball sauce, decadent. This traditional Norwegian dish, unlike my experience in Stockholm, can be served alongside mushy peas, as well as the more typical potatoes and, as within Stockholm, lingonberry sauce. Rokelaks. Norwegian smoked salmon is a staple of Oslo's culinary scene. When I tried it, it was served alongside a boiled egg, moist and fluffy brown bread, mayonnaise, and butter. Rundstykker med rekesalat. At the Norwegian Folk Museum, I tried a typical Norwegian sandwich called rundstykker med rekesalat, a traditional Norwegian bread roll topped in a shrimp salad blend that the kind lady behind the counter told me was the best representation of a typical Norwegian lunch. I can see why. It was fresh and light. While there are obvious variations in some of the classic meals and street foods, you'll find that both the tastes of Reykjavik and Oslo are delicious and warm and perfect for those long, harsh winters. Except for the fermented shark. Never, ever again. The soundtrack of Reykjavik is serene and generally quite quiet, although I won't pretend there aren't a few surprising tracks. There's definitely a youthful energy here, especially as you get closer to the University of Iceland. For one, especially in the downtown areas, you can hear a ton of dance music and chattering crowds, and also a lot of Nordic heavy metal playing from the bars and clubs. Question for the comments on this, is Icelandic punk a thing? Because it seems like it should be. Small though it is, you won't escape the city sounds of car traffic and the dinging of bike bells throughout town. But, like I said before, generally speaking, the soundscape feels just as remote as Iceland itself. Thanks to its seaside location and nautical nature, as you picture yourself within Reykjavik's colorful, tin metal streets, you'll both hear and feel a brisk, heavy wind roaring past your ears, the chaotic and yet soothing cry of seagulls, and the clapping of those salty waves against the sea barrier. Oslo isn't necessarily a big city either, but it's significantly larger than Reykjavik, which naturally makes the soundscape more bustling. Especially in Centrum, the sounds of chattering crowds, construction noise, the screech of the city's many trams on their tracks, cutlery clanking from the outdoor diners, although this is probably only prevalent in the summer months, and birds chirping away fill your ears. Much like Reykjavik, Oslo's placement on the deep, icy black waters of the Oslo fjord and harbor leads to a soundscape that's incredibly nautical. Particularly on Oslo's islands and near the edge of the harbor, you'll hear the sounds of crashing waves, seagulls crying, and boat horns. Here's how the soundscapes of Reykjavik and Oslo stack up. Reykjavik experiences a subpolar oceanic climate, which means cool summers, yes, but also that the winters, while still absolutely frigid, are actually relatively mild. Put it this way, the average high temperature in January is 37 degrees Fahrenheit. In Fairbanks, Alaska, at the same latitude, the average is just above 0 degrees Fahrenheit. For temperatures that cold in Reykjavik, you'll have to check out the man-made ice caves inside the Perlan Museum. Although a bit south of Reykjavik and not as battered by the winds of the ocean, Oslo is still one of the northernmost capitals in the world and can get pretty cold. Oslo has a humid continental climate, meaning that it sees warm summers and cold, snowy winters. In fact, winters can actually get even colder in Oslo, although the summertime lasts a good bit longer. That being said though, even in the late springtime, days can still feel quite misty and chilly, and the icy water in the Oslo fjord can feel freezing year-round. Contrary to what the internet might tell you, it's okay to romanticize things. That's what makes the novelty of traveling so exhilarating. That said, to really capture the spirit and magic of places around the world, you have to let your imagination roam a little bit wild. After all, urban legends, mythological fairy tales, and dramatized history are a big part of the identity of cities and countries worldwide, and the stories and lore that Reykjavik and Oslo bring to the table carry a lot of weight. Letting fantasy and folklore infiltrate your mind as you wander about can really bring out the mystique and the charm in different places. Let's take a look at the ambience that each city evokes. We'll kick off in Reykjavik. Iceland at large feels like it's an alien planet. You have mind-boggling glaciers, beaches of black sand, molten lava on the side of the highway, geothermal springs, and colossal waterfalls. Reykjavik, in many ways, feels like the human settlement outpost on that alien planet, with some obvious twists. It isn't just the otherworldly surroundings that make the city feel this way. The tin metal houses, the geothermal pools like at the Sky Lagoon, the volcanic basalt-inspired Hallgrímskirkja, and futuristic-looking museums like Perlan give Reykjavik an ambience of remoteness and ruggedness while simultaneously emphasizing its deep connection with Iceland's dramatic geography. Now, the twist to that human settlement on an alien planet vibe is that there's still a very present connection to the stories and legends of old Icelandic sagas, inspired by Viking settlers from centuries past. By the way, contrary to popular belief, there were in fact Vikings in Iceland. They just didn't have anything to raid, so they stuck around and became farmers. All that said, it's easy to imagine an elven world hiding within those mountains or the jagged continental divide at Thingvellir National Park. And if you're ever here in person, I definitely recommend allowing yourself to believe that they're out there too. It just adds to the magic of the experience. Now, on the flip side, Norway in general feels like an adventurous fantasy forest. Mystical, rugged, and, of course, magical. Oslo feels like a hidden, modern, and yet storied metropolis within that fantasy world. There's a bit of a strange and mysterious vibe in Oslo, but not in a bad way. Perhaps this is accentuated by places like the Munch Museum, which has a decidedly dark ambience to it, the old wooden-staved churches, the foggy hillsides, the mystical fjords and icy seawater that sits at Oslo's edge, or just that generally more secluded feeling. But then there's also a lighthearted magic to the city, really shining through in the medieval fortresses like Akershus, grand parliamentary buildings, a decidedly royal history, and the wooden friezes depicting mythological Norwegian folklore. Oslo's remoteness, mythology, and forested hillsides create an ambience that whisks you away into the Viking tales of old, where mythological creatures like trolls still scurry around in the mossy island woods, and where a great adventure always feels a corner's turn away. The idea here isn't to pit these two cities up against each other. In fact, the idea is to celebrate the fact that there is so much world to discover, experience, and explore. Thanks for diving into the Nordic capital cities of Reykjavik and Oslo with me today, and stay tuned for more city comparisons in the near future. As always, thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you next time.